Imagine a room the size of a closet. No windows, a single fluorescent light humming overhead. You've lived in a space barely bigger than a parking spot for years, sometimes decades. You know every crack in the wall, every sound the building makes at 3 a.m. You've memorized the schedule, meals, yard time, lights out. The routine has become your whole world. But tonight, the routine changes. Tonight, they give you a meal of your choosing. Tonight, a chaplain sits with you. Tonight, correctional officers who have watched over you for years check in, not with the cold efficiency of procedure, but with something more human. Something that almost resembles acknowledgement. Tonight, you are moved to a room adjacent to a chamber, and in that chamber there is a table, narrow, flat, shaped like a cross, fitted with leather restraints. You are not going home. The state of California has decided that on this date, at this hour, your time is done. Not by disease, not by accident, by intention, by law, by the deliberate decision of a government acting in the name of justice, in the name of its people, in the name of the dead. 38 states have carried out executions in the modern era of American law. But California, the most populous state in the nation, a state that has held more people on death row than almost anywhere else, California carried out just 13 executions between 1992 and 2006. Then silence. Each of those 13 men sat at the center of a crime so brutal, so devastating, that a jury of their peers decided death was the only answer. Each left behind victims whose families would never be whole again. And each walked into that chamber carrying the full weight of what they had done, and the full weight of what was about to happen to them. This is their story, all of it. The crimes, the victims, the years of waiting, the final hours, and the haunting, unanswerable question that hangs over every single one of them. Is this what justice looks like? These are the final 13. Before we go any further, I need to say something. If you found this video, you already know that this kind of storytelling is rare. Most channels will give you the highlights, the headline, the verdict, the execution date. We go deeper than that. We go into the rooms. We sit with the families. We ask the questions that don't have easy answers. If that is what you are looking for, if you want true crime told with the gravity it deserves, then hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because this channel is where those stories live. Don't be the person who watches this video, gets to the end, and then can't find us again. Subscribe now. You won't regret it. Story 1. Robert Alton Harris. Executed April 21st, 1992. July 5th, 1978. A McDonald's parking lot in San Diego. Two teenagers, John Majewski, 16, and Michael Baker, 16, are sitting in a car eating lunch. They have no idea that the man approaching them is about to change the trajectory of California criminal history forever. Robert Alton Harris was 26 years old. He needed a car. He and his brother Daniel were planning a bank robbery, and they needed a clean vehicle, one that wasn't connected to them. The boy's car was perfect. Harris approached the vehicle, forced them at gunpoint, and ordered them to drive to a remote area near Miramar Reservoir. What happened next is almost incomprehensible in its cold-bloodedness. Harris shot both boys. John Mayeski was shot in the back as he tried to run. Michael Baker was shot in the face. Then, according to witnesses and Harris's own brother, who testified against him, Robert Alton Harris went back to the car, unwrapped the boys' half-eaten hamburgers, and finished their lunches. He laughed. He said the boys had died like punks. Then he and his brother drove to the bank, robbed it, and were arrested a few hours later. Harris's childhood had been one of relentless violence and trauma. His mother was a severe alcoholic. He was born prematurely after she was kicked in the stomach. He was physically abused throughout his early years. His attorneys would argue repeatedly that the man sitting on death row was himself a product of profound neglect and damage. His IQ tested in ranges that suggested possible cognitive impairment. None of it was enough. The jury convicted Harris of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. And then he waited. 14 years. For 14 years, Robert Alton Harris sat on San Quentin's death row while his case wound through appeal after appeal after appeal. During that time, California's gas chamber sat idle. The state had not executed anyone since 1967. There were legal challenges, stays, reprieves. On the morning of April 21, 1992, Harris was actually strapped into the gas chamber and then pulled out twice as last-minute appeals came through. Federal judges issued stays. The Supreme Court vacated those stays. It was a legal and procedural chaos that drew national media to the prison gates. At 6:21 a.m., Robert Alton Harris entered the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison for the last time. He was strapped to the chair. Sodium cyanide pellets were dropped into a vat of acid beneath him. The gas rose. He lost consciousness within minutes and was pronounced dead at 6:21 a.m. His last words were, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." California had just carried out its first execution in 25 years. The machine had been restarted. 13 people would follow him. The families of John Mayeski and Michael Baker, 2 16-year-old boys who just wanted lunch, had waited 14 years for this day. Story 2. David Edwin Mason. Executed August 24th, 1993. The thing about David Edwin Mason is that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. Not once, not twice, 4 times in a killing spree that targeted the most vulnerable people he could find: the elderly, the alone, the trusting. In 1980, Mason broke into the homes of 4 elderly victims in the Bay Area and killed them. His method was strangulation, slow, deliberate, requiring physical proximity to the person whose life he was ending. His victims were people who had opened their doors to a stranger or who had simply been at home when Mason chose their house. They ranged in age from 60 to 76. They were killed for whatever cash or property Mason could find inside. Then, while awaiting trial for those murders, Mason killed again. This time, his victim was a fellow inmate in the Contra Costa County Jail. He strangled the man in his cell. Mason later said that killing had become, in his words, natural. When Mason finally went to trial, he waived his right to a jury and pled guilty to 4 of the murders. He was sentenced to death. Then, and this is where Mason's case takes a distinctly unusual turn, he waived his appeals. He told the courts he wanted to die. He called capital punishment appropriate for what he had done. He said prolonging his life on death row would be an insult to his victims. The legal system spent years trying to determine whether Mason was competent to make that decision, or whether he was suffering from a mental illness that made his waiver invalid. Courts went back and forth. Ultimately, his waiver stood. On August 24, 1993, David Edwin Mason was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. He was calm. He showed no remorse and asked for none in return. There are no famous last words from Mason, just silence. The kind that 4 elderly victims never got. Story 3. William George Bonin. Executed February 23, 1996. His name was William Bonin. History remembers him as the freeway killer, and the full scope of what he did, the sheer number of lives he destroyed, the methodical nature of his violence, remains one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. Between 1979 and 1980, William Bonin murdered at least 14 young men and boys. Most were hitchhikers or runaways. Most were picked up along the freeways of Southern California, hence the name that would follow him forever. Their ages ranged from 14 to 19. He worked with accomplices, men he recruited, sometimes coerced, into participating in the abductions, the torture, the killings. He was the architect. He was the one who chose the victims, who controlled the crimes, who disposed of the bodies along roadsides and freeway embankments. Bonin had a prior conviction for child molestation. He had been released from a state hospital just 2 years before the killing spree began. His history of violence against young men stretched back to his early adulthood, and yet the system had released him. The families of his victims would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Bonin's accomplices testified against him. Physical evidence connected him to multiple murders. He was convicted of 14 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. On death row, Bonin seemed remarkably untroubled. He maintained his innocence in public statements while simultaneously giving interviews in which he described the murders in graphic detail. He seemed to enjoy the attention. He seemed to enjoy being known. William Bonin requested a large last meal: 2 pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 15 cans of Pepsi. He ate all of it. On February 23, 1996, California switched its execution method from the gas chamber to lethal injection. Bonin was the first person executed in California by lethal injection. His last words were a statement about forgiving those who had wronged him in life, a performance of grace that sat uneasily with everything he had done. 14 families, 14 sons who never came home. A mother somewhere told her boy was found on a roadside. The freeway killer was dead. The freeway stretched on. Story 4. Keith Daniel Williams. Executed May 3, 1996. Some cases hinge on questions of guilt that linger for decades. Keith Daniel Williams's case does not. The evidence against him was direct, documented, and devastating. In 1978, Williams shot and killed 3 people, 2 men and a pregnant woman, in a dispute rooted in something as ordinary as a bad check. The argument escalated. Williams retrieved a firearm. The shooting lasted only seconds. The deaths lasted forever. One of the victims was pregnant. a life not yet born, a future erased before it started. Williams spent 18 years on death row. During that time, he exhausted his appeals. His case generated far less public debate than some of the others that would follow. There were no international campaigns for clemency, no celebrity advocates, no high-profile controversies about guilt or innocence. On May 3, 1996, Keith Daniel Williams was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin. He was the second person California executed that year, just 10 weeks after William Bonin. His last words were brief. He said he was at peace. The 3 people he killed never got to say whether they were. Story 5. Thomas M. Thompson. Executed July 14, 1998. The case of Thomas M. Thompson is one of the most contested in California death penalty history, and for reasons that have less to do with the horror of the crime than with the labyrinthine legal proceedings that followed it. In September 1981, 20-year-old Ginger Fleischle was found in a field in Orange County. She had been raped and murdered. Thomas Thompson, who had been dating Fleischle, was convicted of the crime. His trial co-defendant, David Leach, pleaded guilty to rape and testified against Thompson, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange. But Thompson's case never stopped being complicated. On appeal, federal courts found that Thompson had received ineffective assistance of counsel. A federal judge granted him a new trial. Then the Ninth Circuit overturned that decision. The case ping-ponged through the courts for nearly 2 decades. Legal scholars debated whether Thompson had received a fair trial. His supporters maintained he was innocent. Governor Pete Wilson denied clemency. The Supreme Court declined to intervene. On July 14, 1998, Thomas M. Thompson was executed by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence until the end. His final statement was a declaration that he did not commit the crime for which he was dying. Whether he was right or wrong, Ginger Fleischle was still dead, and the legal process that was supposed to bring certainty to her family had left behind instead a case that continued to generate doubt, and that doubt became its own kind of grief. Story 6. Jataroon Siripongs. Executed February 9, 1999. On December 17, 1981, a Garden Grove retail store became a crime scene. Jataroon Siripongs walked in during the evening hours. He shot and killed the store manager, Pakovan Watanaporn, and a store clerk, Kwok Muen. He took cash from the register. He walked out. Siripongs was Thai-born. He had come to the United States legally and was working in Southern California at the time of the murders. He was arrested, tried, and convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. During his years on death row, Siripongs underwent what many described as a genuine transformation. He became deeply devout in his Buddhist faith. He mentored other inmates. The Thai royal family and the Thai government appealed for clemency on his behalf. Pope John Paul II made a personal appeal to Governor Gray Davis. Amnesty International took up his case. His execution became an international incident. Governor Davis denied clemency. On February 9, 1999, Jataroon Siripongs was executed at San Quentin. In his final statement, he expressed remorse for the harm he had caused and asked for forgiveness. 2 store workers going about an ordinary evening shift, 2 families destroyed, and a man who, by all accounts, had become someone very different from the person who had pulled the trigger, but who the law said could not be spared. Story 7. Manuel Babbitt, executed May 4th, 1999. This is where the story gets complicated in a way that doesn't resolve neatly. Because Manuel Babbitt was not a calculated predator. He was a broken man who had served his country in one of its most brutal wars, and who had come home to find that no one knew how to help him. Babbitt served with the United States Marines in Vietnam. He saw combat. He was awarded the Purple Heart. He was diagnosed years later with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from episodes in which he was functionally not in reality, not present in the world as it existed, but transported back to the jungle, back to the firefights, back to the violence that had rewired his mind during the war. On December 19, 1980, Babbitt broke into the home of 78-year-old Leah Schendel in Sacramento. He beat her. He robbed her. She did not die from the beating. She died from a heart attack induced by the terror of the attack. She was 78 years old. She was alone. Babbitt's brother William turned him in to police after reading about the attack in the newspaper. It was an act that haunted William Babbitt for the rest of his life, one he publicly said he regretted because he believed his brother needed treatment, not execution. At trial, Babbitt's Vietnam service and PTSD diagnosis were presented as mitigating factors. The jury heard evidence about his mental state. They convicted him anyway and sentenced him to death. The case became a cause for veterans groups, mental health advocates, and opponents of capital punishment. The question at the heart of the debate was this: when a man is broken by a war fought in the name of the country that is now choosing to execute him, what does justice actually mean? Governor Gray Davis denied clemency. He later said it was one of the hardest decisions of his governorship. On May 4, 1999, Manuel Babbitt was executed at San Quentin. He was 56 years old. A military honor guard was present at his burial. He was buried with the Purple Heart he had earned in the jungles of Vietnam. Leah Schendel was 78 years old. She was alone in her home when a stranger came through her door. She died terrified. There is no version of this story where everyone is wrong and everyone is right. There is only the weight of it. I need to pause here. What you just heard, Manuel Babbitt's story, is one that I think deserves your honest reaction. Was the right decision made? Is PTSD a mitigating factor in a capital case? If someone is broken by the very country that later executes them, is that justice? Or is it something else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is a conversation worth having. I read every comment, and the best discussions on this channel start right here. Tell me where you stand. Story 8. Daryl Keith Rich, executed March 15, 2000. In the summer and fall of 1979, the communities around Redding, California lived in fear. A predator was operating in the hills, a man who targeted women, who attacked them with ferocious violence, who left a trail of trauma and death across the region. Daryl Keith Rich was 22 years old when he began his attacks. He had a history of violence, prior arrests, prior assaults. The pattern of escalation was visible in retrospect, but it did not stop him in time. Between June and November of 1979, Rich murdered 4 women. Annette Edwards, 18. Patricia Moore, 19. Linda Slavic, 26. Antoinette Lycan, 11. The youngest was 11 years old. He sexually assaulted several other women who survived. His attacks were characterized by extreme physical violence and sexual assault. Rich was arrested in November 1979. The evidence against him was substantial. He was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to death. At San Quentin, Rich spent 20 years on death row. He exhausted his legal appeals and eventually, like David Mason before him, indicated that he was prepared to accept his sentence. On March 15, 2000, Darrell Keith Rich was executed by lethal injection. His final words were a statement of peace. Annette Edwards was 18. Patricia Moore was 19. Antoinette Lycan was 11 years old. They never got to make statements about being at peace. Story 9. Robert Lee Massey, executed March 27, 2001. Robert Lee Massey holds a particular kind of grim distinction in the history of California's death row. He had, in effect, already walked this road before. He had already killed. He had already been sentenced to die. And then the system had given him another chance, and he had used that chance to kill again. In 1965, Massey murdered a woman named Mildred Weiss during a robbery in San Gabriel. He was convicted and sentenced to death. But in 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled, in response to the landmark Furman v. Georgia decision, that all existing death sentences in the state were unconstitutional. Robert Lee Massey's sentence was commuted to life in prison. He was paroled in 1978. 13 months later, he walked into Boris Naumoff's liquor store in San Gabriel, shot and killed the owner, and stole the contents of the register. He was sentenced to death again. His case spent more than 2 decades in the appellate system. Legal challenges, habeas corpus petitions, questions about the adequacy of his counsel. During that time, Massey became a jailhouse attorney of sorts, helping other inmates with their legal filings. Eventually, Massey too waived his remaining appeals. He said he was tired. He said he was ready. On March 27, 2001, Robert Lee Massey was executed at San Quentin. Boris Naumoff ran a liquor store. He was murdered by a man who had already been given a second chance that Boris Naumoff was never given. Story 10. Stephen Wayne Anderson, executed January 29, 2002. Stephen Wayne Anderson was hired to kill someone. That was how he earned his living, as a contract killer. And by the time California executed him in 2002, he had done it before, in Utah, where he had killed an inmate at the point of a shiv manufactured inside prison walls. He was a man for whom killing had become transactional. In November 1980, Anderson was released on parole from a Utah prison. Within weeks, he was in California. He broke into the home of 81-year-old Elizabeth Lyman, who lived in San Bernardino County. He had been hired, it was alleged, to commit a burglary. What he actually did was murder an 81-year-old woman. Elizabeth Lyman was found dead, shot. Anderson was arrested, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder. His prior homicide in Utah was introduced at the penalty phase. The jury voted for death. Anderson's case moved slowly through the courts. During his time on death row, he became an artist. His paintings, detailed, technically accomplished works, generated significant attention. An exhibition of his artwork was held in Beverly Hills, which drew protests from victims' rights advocates. The question of whether art or transformation can change a death sentence is one California has confronted more than once. In Anderson's case, the answer was no. On January 29, 2002, Stephen Wayne Anderson was executed by lethal injection. His last words were a statement in which he spoke about love, forgiveness, and finding peace. Elizabeth Lyman was 81 years old. She was killed in her home. Story 11. Donald Beardsley, executed January 19, 2005. 3 years passed between Anderson's execution and the next one. 3 years in which California's death row continued to swelled past 600 inmates, past 650, eventually becoming the largest death row population in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, the chamber stayed quiet until January 2005. Donald Beardsley had a history that followed a trajectory California courts had seen before. Prior murder, release, murder again. In 1969, Beardsley murdered a woman in Missouri. He served time, was released, relocated to California. In 1981, he killed 2 young women, Stacy Benjamin and Patty Gedling, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Both women were in their early 20s. Both were murdered as part of a dispute over a drug debt. Both died because they were, in the logic of Beardsley's world, liabilities. He was convicted and sentenced to death. By the time his execution date arrived, Beardsley was 61 years old. He had spent more than 2 decades on death row. He suffered from neurological problems, brain damage, his lawyers argued, that affected his cognitive functioning. There were legal challenges, clemency petitions, and appeals to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger based on Beardsley's mental state. Schwarzenegger denied clemency. On January 19, 2005, Donald Beardsley became the first person executed in California in 3 years. He was pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m. 3 women, 3 different years, 3 different states. One man whose violence the system failed to stop in time. Story 12. Stanley Tookie Williams, executed December 13, 2005. There are executions that are legal events. There are executions that are news items. And then there is Stanley Tookie Williams, whose death became a global referendum on redemption, race, justice, and the soul of capital punishment itself. Williams was a giant of a man in every sense, physically imposing, a bodybuilder of extraordinary size, intellectually driven, and in 1971, a co-founder of the Crips street gang in Los Angeles. The Crips would grow into one of the most notorious criminal organizations in American history. Williams's role in its founding made him a symbol, for some, of destruction, for others, of a generation failed by poverty and racism. In 1979, Williams robbed and murdered 4 people in 2 separate incidents. Albert Owens, a 26-year-old 7-Eleven clerk, was shot in the back at close range. Then, 11 days later, Williams killed Yenny Yang, Sai Shen Yang, and Yu Chin Yang Lee, a Taiwanese immigrant family who ran a motel in Los Angeles. He was convicted on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. Williams maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. His supporters pointed to what they said was a flawed trial, unreliable witnesses, and prosecutorial misconduct. But the transformation story was impossible to ignore. On death row, Williams became an entirely different public figure. He wrote a series of children's books aimed at steering young people away from gang life. He co-authored an autobiography. He was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Celebrities, civil rights leaders, and international figures rallied around him. From his cell at San Quentin, Stanley Tookie Williams had, by almost any measure, become an anti-violence advocate with genuine reach and genuine impact. The clemency petition to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger was one of the most publicized in American history. The question before Schwarzenegger was not simple. Did the transformation of a man on death row, if real, change the moral calculus of executing him? Schwarzenegger's answer was no. In a lengthy written statement, the governor said that Williams had never acknowledged guilt, never expressed remorse to the families of the 4 people he had killed, and that the sincerity of his redemption was therefore in question. On December 13, 2005, Stanley Tookie Williams was executed at San Quentin at 12:35 a.m. Witnesses described him as dignified. He did not make a formal final statement. He looked at his supporters in the viewing gallery and mouthed something that those watching believed were the words, "I love you." The debate did not end when the drugs were administered. It has never really ended. The families of Albert Owens and the Yang family had lost people they loved. Williams had written books. Both of those things were true at the same time. Justice does not always resolve into simplicity. Sometimes it just leaves you with the silence and the question. Story 13. Clarence Ray Allen. Executed January 17, 2006. And then there is Clarence Ray Allen, the last one. By the time California strapped Allen to the execution table, he was 76 years old. He was legally blind. He was deaf. He used a wheelchair. He had suffered a heart attack on death row just months before his scheduled execution, and his lawyers went to court arguing that executing a man in such profound physical decline, a man who had to be resuscitated just to be executed, constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The courts disagreed. But let's start at the beginning, because Allen's story is, in many ways, the most elaborately evil of all 13. In 1974, Allen hired a young man named Billy Ray Hamilton to burglarize his own son's employer, a grocery store called Fran's Market in Fresno. A 17-year-old employee named Mary Sue Kitts witnessed the robbery and told police. Allen had her killed. Hamilton murdered her, and Allen was convicted of ordering the murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. From inside his prison cell, Allen was furious. He believed there were other witnesses to his crimes who might testify against him in future proceedings. And so, from prison, Clarence Ray Allen orchestrated another set of murders. He sent word through intermediaries. He arranged for hitmen to go to Fran's Market and kill everyone who knew too much. On September 5, 1980, gunmen entered Fran's Market and murdered 3 people: Brian Schledowitz, 27, Douglas Scott White, 18, and Josephine Rocha, 17 years old. They had been witnesses. They had done nothing wrong except know what they knew. Allen was charged with the 3 murders, convicted, and sentenced to death. He spent 23 years on death row. His final appeal rested on the argument that executing a man who was 76, wheelchair-bound, deaf, and near blind constituted excessive cruelty. It did not prevail. In the hours before his execution, Allen reportedly told guards that he hoped his heart would give out before the lethal injection, a grim final act of defiance, the desire to deny the state the satisfaction of doing what he feared it was determined to do. It didn't give out. On January 17, 2006, at 12:01 a.m., Clarence Ray Allen was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. His last words? "It's all under control." And with that, California stopped. No more executions. A de facto moratorium that extended into years, into a decade, into the present day. The state that houses more than 700 people on death row, more than almost anywhere else, has not carried out a single execution since Clarence Ray Allen. 17-year-old Josephine Rocha. She was killed because she worked at a grocery store and she knew too much. She was the last victim whose killer California would execute. 13 people. 13 executions in 14 years. And then, nothing. What do we make of that silence? Is it mercy? Is it indecision? Is it the state quietly acknowledging that the machine is too broken to run, that the risk of killing the wrong person is too great, or that the process takes too long, costs too much, and delivers too little in the way of what we call closure? Or is it something else? Is it the growing unease that arrives when you look at these 13 stories together? The veterans with PTSD, the men who transformed themselves on death row, the cases clouded by legal questions, the victims' families who waited decades, and you ask yourself whether any of it actually served the purpose we said it would. The families of the murdered. They are the people who matter most in these stories, and they are the people we most often discuss last. Some of them said executions brought peace. Some said they didn't. Some sat in the viewing gallery at San Quentin and watched the needle go in and felt nothing change. Some felt everything change. There is no single answer there either. California has 714 people on death row right now. If execution is the answer, it is an answer the state has almost entirely stopped giving. If it isn't the answer, no one has found a better one. These 13 men committed acts that ended lives. Real people with names and families and futures. John Majewski and Michael Baker eating lunch. Leah Schendel alone at home. Josephine Rocha working a shift at a grocery store. Ginger Fleischle and the Yang family, and Boris Naumoff and Elizabeth Lyman, and all the others. The full, irreducible weight of what was taken from them. And then the state decided, on their behalf and in their names, to take something in return. 13 times it made that decision. Then it stopped. Whether it should start again, or whether it should stop forever, and what that would mean, and whether justice without execution is still justice, those questions belong to all of us. Not just California, not just juries, all of us. These were the final 13, and the question they leave behind is still being asked. You just witnessed something, not entertainment, something real. 13 lives, 13 deaths, and the impossible weight of what justice asks of us. This has been The Final 13. Thank you for watching.